Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jennifer Cissé. I'm a Senior Risk Manager at the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and really happy to have you in this breakout session. So just a couple of seconds to begin regarding housekeeping. Please use the chat. You're free to use the chat now to introduce yourself. If you don't see the chat, there should be a button on the left that says public chat. You can use the hand raising function, which we will use during the discussion at the end. So please use that hand raising function on the bottom right, and you'll be called on during the discussion. At which time you can use the microphone and camera. So please plan on using your microphone and camera to ask your question live. You can introduce yourself before asking your question. There may be a button that you can use to shrink down the slides, but that we will only use during the discussion. And then there's also another button that you can use next to the hand on the far right at the bottom of the screen if you minimize the presentation, that you can use to restore it. As a reminder, the sessions are being recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, then do not use your microphone and camera, just leave them off, and do not put anything in the chat. If you're fine having your chat recorded, then feel free to use the chat if you don't want to be on camera. And after the session, please feel free to continue the conversation on Risk Talk, and you can see the link here, InsuResilience.org/Risk Talk. Excellent. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. We're really happy to have you here for this breakout session on impact and monitoring and evaluation, specifically digging into the evidence roadmap, which was launched yesterday. As I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Cissé. I'm a Senior Research Manager at the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and I'm really happy to be moderating this session. So today, what are we going to talk about? I'm going to give a brief introduction that overviews a little bit about what is in the evidence roadmap. And then I'm really excited that we have the authors from the 6 different thematic sections who will be joining to discuss the importance of each of the different themes that were included in the evidence roadmap. Then we'll be having a discussion about joint actions. That's an evidence framework that is proposed in the roadmap, and the way forward, how different actors can be involved to advance work under the evidence roadmap. And then we'll have a brief conclusion before having an open discussion with all of you. Please make sure your microphone is muted. Thank you. So what is the CDRFI evidence roadmap? The actual name is From Innovation to Learning, a strategic evidence roadmap for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. And the purpose of this roadmap is to move the focus of the CDRFI community away from a focus on innovating new solutions to really making sure we're taking the time to learn and produce evidence about what's working and to share that learning within the community. So the roadmap is a tool for advocating both for increased and targeted donor investment, but also for specific research investments. And as I think was shared yesterday, the evidence roadmap was developed as a result of a year-long, incredibly participatory process. We started with a workshop that many of you, okay, there seems to be a problem with the sound.
Maybe I quickly jump in here.
Yeah.
So if you just came from the main session and you still have the main session window open, you need to switch off the audio in the main session, and then you will only hear the audio from this session. I hope that works for you.
Great, thank you, Kai. So as I was mentioning, the evidence roadmap was developed as a result of a really participatory process that involved a workshop that was open to the public, and we developed in such a way to make sure that we could encourage lots of different types of participation from all over the world. And then we really worked closely with the impact working group of the InsuResilience Global Partnership to develop the evidence priorities or the different themes, I should say, as well as the joint actions. And then we relied on the work of experts to identify the priorities through consultation with others in the field. So it's been quite a really robust participatory process. And I'm thrilled to say that the evidence roadmap is now available on the InsuResilience Knowledge Hub. It's also available on the MCII website, and you can find a link to the whole roadmap document in the chat. Thank you, Yannick. So just quickly before we jump into the authors that giving their perspectives on the different themes, there are 6 different evidence themes that are the way that the different evidence priorities are categorized. 3 of those are from perspectives and 3 of those are cross-cutting. So the 3 perspectives are people and client-focused perspectives, national and public sector perspectives, and a perspective that looks at the global risk finance architecture, global risk finance action. And then there are 3 cross-cutting, one looking at gender dimensions and impacts of CDRFI, another looking at risk information and analysis, and a 3rd cross-cutting theme looking at resilience outcomes. Within each of these themes, the evidence priorities are broken into 3 different categories, and there may be 2, 3, or 4 different evidence priorities within each category in each theme. So those categories are quick impact, persistent questions, and transformational evidence. So quick impact is areas where we would expect that research investments could really generate very quick and perhaps really helpful evidence that could be used immediately to help transform programs. Persistent questions are issues that we've been tackling for a long time within the community and that really need concerted research investments in order to be able to get robust and replicable findings. And then transformational evidence is areas where we think that some investment, interdisciplinary work, and long-term research could lead to really transformational change in the CDRFI space. So now I'm going to turn over to our first speaker. Chiu is an associate director at the Innovation Lab for Markets Risk and Resilience at UC Davis and a project manager for the Quality Index Insurance Certification Project. And she's going to be talking about the section that she co-authored on people and client-focused perspectives. Tara, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Jen. Okay, well, first I want to thank you very much for involving us at UC Davis in the project. We're quite excited to contribute. So we know that uninsured risk changes how households and families make their decisions in ways that affect their families and their livelihoods today and well into the future. When shocks occur, households often resort to selling assets or reducing consumption, and even in the absence of disaster, avoiding risky but potentially profitable productive investments as a way to try to manage their risk exposure. But evidence today has demonstrated that quality CDRFI products can actually reduce reliance on these costly coping mechanisms and enable investment and growth. So there's been significant investment in increasing the availability and accessibility of these products. But as access increases, it's also important to critically examine not only the potential of these products, but also the potential pitfalls and to identify new opportunities for high impact investments. So to make prudent resilience investment decisions, more evidence is needed to inform disaster risk finance investments, particularly around ensuring product quality, making solutions salient for farmers, expanding product offerings, and in general, understanding how to maximize the potential for positive impacts and minimize the potential for negative ones. So there are a number of different research areas that have the potential to rather quickly improve how we design disaster risk finance and insurance products, such as developing and testing approaches to make products more salient, attractive, and valuable to people and clients. Emerging innovations in these areas can quite rapidly be designed, deployed, and tested to determine how they may increase both uptake and impacts of the tools that already exist. In addition, despite increasing global investments and expanding access and uptake, there are a number of persistent challenges that exist and a number of opportunities to both strengthen existing products and to expand product offerings, not only to smallholder farmers, but also to others in the value chains. So talking about the first one first, inconsistent product quality continues to plague CDRFI solutions. Low quality products fail, not providing compensation when the client experiences extreme losses and when they most need assistance. We've also seen products that provide payouts too late to really offer any meaningful protection. So if we start acknowledging these inherent challenges, acknowledging the weaknesses and limitations of these existing products, we can then map a way forward to try to generate evidence to design and test solutions that both ensure product value, but then also increase it further for people and clients. Second, considering expanding product offerings beyond smallholder agriculturists to others in the value chain, it's by and large remained under research to this point. There are opportunities to investigate how to effectively design and deliver quality products to others in the value chain, both upstream and downstream, such as small and medium enterprises, agro dealers, or even laborers. Another thing that we've been seeing is that the global community is increasingly investing in macro, including sovereign products, which I know we'll hear more about from the other speakers and the other themes. But what I want to focus on here is that there's still some lack of clarity as to whether or not there are impacts of these interventions on the ground level, and to be able to assess the downstream welfare impacts of these investments on people and clients. So just making sure that all levels of disaster risk finance are carefully examined to avoid pitfalls and maximize the potential impacts on people and clients. And then there are also a few evidence gaps that, if addressed, may dramatically change how we approach disaster risk finance. In particular, there might be ways for us to better understand how disaster risk management tools interact with other risks people face, and as well as how the tools interact with each other. For example, examining potential links between climate change, disaster risk finance, and conflict, and understanding the role that insurance might play in competition for resources and conflict. Also, as sovereign instruments continue to develop structure for the distribution of benefits to beneficiaries, are there ways that we can use these platforms to better integrate access, demand, and value for microinsurance? So as we move forward and look at the evidence roadmap, we're looking forward to seeing where these things go, and are very grateful for the long-term commitment to research and the acknowledgement of the importance of these issues and investments in research and evidence building. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. I didn't realize that there would be a delay in turning my camera back on. So, but thank you so much for that intervention. And I'm happy now to turn over to Marcella Terezona, who's going to talk about national and public sector perspectives. Marcella is the head of climate finance and economics for Genesis Analytics. Marcella, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. So I hope you can hear me. So thank you. I will start the session again, thanking all the efforts of this team. I think we've worked together, as Jen mentioned earlier, for a long time, and it's I agree with Jen. It was a result of a very consultative process, so not just within us, but what I want to highlight is that we interviewed many stakeholders from many different places. So just to reassure you that we've been trying to include, to make this dialogue not just among us, but with governments, with donors, with NGOs, civil society, academia, etc. So my section talks about national public sector perspectives. This was co-authored with Lina, who will be talking is the next speaker, and Valentina Ramirez, a colleague of mine at Genesis Analytics. And we were trying to understand the evidence gaps in the area of at the national level. So products and policies at the national level, looking at public sector perspectives. I found it extremely interesting that that there was no one talking about the instruments as such, and the topics that really came, and I'll go a little bit more systematically through them, but were around political economy, human behavior, and some of the better understanding of some of the impacts of for example, making public services shock responsive, public assets. So it was really more about understanding there was an acknowledgement, I think, in the community saying, look, I mean, we've made a lot of progress in the design of good instruments. There is a risk layer approach. Many governments are starting to work with this in mind, but there is still some work to be done to integrate this progress into national plans, public finance, etc., etc. So it was an interesting follow-up to a paper that we wrote together with the Center for Disaster Protection, in which we did a very complementary exercise, which was really around an academic literature, a review of the academic literature, trying to understand what was the evidence. So a very similar topic, but this was really based on the academic literature. And for this exercise, it was a complement saying, so what are the gaps? What are people asking for? So after this general introduction, because I thought sometimes it's easier to have a general benchmark, I'm going to go a little bit more systematically through some of the questions. Again, they're going to be divided in the same way in which Jen explained at the beginning. So those around quick impact, those around persistent questions, and those about transformational questions. So in terms of quick impact, I'm going to start with a very obvious one. We're not going to be surprised, but COVID-19 was there, like as like saying, look, there's an emergency, there's a shock, which is similar to what we have with disasters or climate-related disasters. What can we learn? So both in terms of how to get the money quickly into a government, but also in terms of getting the money out. So that was kind of like an obvious one, but I think it's real, and it's something that we can quickly learn quite a lot. So we could produce a lot of material around that. And then the other two, where I mentioned them a little bit in the introduction. I mean, one of them is we really need to understand the political economy of CDRFI. So we need to understand the structure, the institutions, the actors. So in a way, we need to unlock from the perspective of the national systems that the actors can really embrace and adopt all these instruments. And the third question for quick impact was, sorry about my voice, what is the impact of using pre-agreed finance for disaster reconstruction of public assets? So that was another topic that came through in you will see in the other levels of questions as well, which is we need a better understanding of what is the socioeconomic impacts and what is the fiscal impacts of using pre-agreed finance to quickly reconstruct public assets. Moving on to the persistent questions, these were very much related to public finance. So the questions were around like, how can we better understand the incorporation and the work between climate disaster risk financing and public finance? I mean, we all know that when we look at governments of national governments in this topic, we are looking at public finance, we're talking to ministries of finance, but there is still a little bit like not enough incorporation between both of them. So that was something that was highlighted as a persistent question, which people who we interviewed think that that could help quite a lot in improving the implementation of these policies. And lastly, in terms of the transformational level, there was again a call for understanding the non-financial constraints of CDRFI. So it was really like around what are the type of contracts that we should have, what are the information systems that are better suited, and my colleagues were going to be talking about that a little bit later, but that can inform much better and then make sure that there's more credibility around the instruments, and that kind of like the financial instruments are really tailored to the government needs. So again, I mean, just to summarize, because we don't have much more time, I think what was interesting is that there's a lot around making sure that we strengthen national systems, that we understand from political economy perspective, that we understand the linkages between public finance and disaster risk financing. And I'm going to stop here. So thank you very much, and back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Marcela. I appreciate it. Now I'd like to turn over to Lena Weingartner, who's a research associate with ODI in their Global Risks and Resilience program, who's going to be talking about global risk finance action. Lena?
Thanks, Jen. And thank you to all the other co-authors as well for the collaboration on this project and discussions related to evidence priorities across the different themes. As Jen mentioned, the global risk finance theme concerns actors from the global community who engage with CDRFI in multiple countries across diverse contexts, including through humanitarian assistance, climate finance, as well as supporting and rethinking the global risk finance architecture and infrastructure. Questions under the theme focus on evidence priorities for understanding and increasing the impact of CDRFI linked to humanitarian response and global climate finance support. And the theme also includes questions around the complementarity of various CDRFI products, for instance, thinking about linking and layering instruments, as well as the complementarity and support from international structures. The theme and many of the questions linked to it, which are outlined in detail in the evidence roadmap document, are born out of a recognition of some of the existing challenges with humanitarian response and climate finance to a large extent. Humanitarian funding for crisis response, for example, has been shown in many instances to be ad hoc and late, and it can also be unreliable if it's not arranged in advance. So recognition of these issues has contributed to a push for a transformational shift in crisis response systems towards pre-agreed funding and towards more timely action, which is also reflected in many recent partnerships and initiatives such as the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership and its engagement with InsuResilience on the topic of CDRFI and anticipatory action. And it's also reflected in the Crisis Outlook Coalition launched earlier this year. So linked to those initiatives and partnerships are expectations that CDRFI integrated with humanitarian action would contribute to the reliability and the coordination and the speed of humanitarian funding, and also that it would play a role in increasing the transparency and accountability to act ahead of and in response to crises. So ultimately helping save lives and protect livelihoods through those channels. The impacts of climate extremes, which are becoming more frequent and intense as a result of climate change, have also meant that CDRFI has been viewed as a way to support climate change adaptation and to help reduce and mitigate loss and damage. So from research and evaluations carried out to date, part of which were reviewed throughout this evidence roadmap conception process, as Jen outlined earlier, we know that the application of CDRFI to support humanitarian response and climate change adaptation has a lot of potential. So for example, recent studies in Bangladesh and Mongolia have shown that pre-positioned finance linked to an action plan and predetermined triggers resulted in humanitarian assistance being delivered to households much more quickly, and critically that this gain in speed also provided some welfare benefits to households compared to a later response. But we also know, and this was highlighted in a recent review of the literature that Marcela also referred to, that was published by the Center for Disaster Protection, that robust evidence on the overall benefits of prearranged finance for public disaster response, and that includes national governments, for example, but also humanitarian agencies, is still relatively weak. So a greater understanding of this potential and the added value of CDRFI in practice with regards to adaptation finance, the efficiency of humanitarian operations, and the ultimate impact this has on the protection of people, assets, and livelihoods, that Tara referred to earlier, will be really key to guide public policy programs and investments going forward. Ultimately, investing in research, evaluation, and learning to generate and critically also to use this robust evidence about the real-life impacts of CDRFI on humanitarian outcomes and operations, and analyzing what has been working in practice and also what doesn't work, really is critical to help governments and humanitarian agencies to increase the efficiency of their responses and to achieve greater impact protecting those who are most vulnerable to disasters. Engaging with humanitarian and climate change communities has also introduced new frontiers for research and learning to the global risk finance community, which are highlighted in this chapter of the evidence roadmap, including around the applicability and impact of CDRFI in contexts of conflict, protracted crisis, and climate change. Development initiatives found that as of 2018, 9 out of 10 countries with the largest population in need of humanitarian assistance faced conflict and forced displacement. And so talking about CDRFI in humanitarian context and in relation to humanitarian operations also means addressing evidence gaps and practical challenges around doing this in context of conflict and protracted crises. At the same time, climate change, demographic change, and other compounding threats will transform the nature and impacts of disasters in the future. And so this requires a shift in perspective from short-term thinking and a focus on immediate protection of assets towards longer-term understanding of what crises might look like in the future, what that means for CDRFI products, markets, and links with humanitarian and climate action, and the support that's required as a result from the global risk finance infrastructure. So that's another critical gap that's highlighted as a transformational evidence priority in the chapter of this roadmap. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena. I really appreciate it. So now I'd like to hand over to Catherine Miles, who's a gender expert and independent consultant, to talk about the gender dimensions and impacts of CDRFI.
Thank you very much. So my remarks today are really informed by not only the content of the evidence roadmap chapter that I contributed to, but also the work that has been done with the InsuResilience Gender Working Group, who I support. So first of all, the gender dimensions and impacts of CDRFI really do need to be an evidence priority as we invest both in research and action in this area. There is some gender-related evidence, some exists. What exists at the moment focuses on the gender differences in women and men's vulnerabilities to disaster risk and climate change, and also on the gender differential impacts, such as higher mortality rates, for instance, amongst women. There's also evidence that exists on gender differences in access to and usage of finance. I think we're all probably well aware about this 9% gender gap in account ownership for developing countries, according to the last World Bank Index data. But despite this evidence, there really does remain significant gaps, both in the breadth and depth of evidence on the gender dimensions specific to CDRFI. The pockets of evidence that exist relate to very specific cultural and geographical context. And given really the importance of cultural context in defining social norms related to gender, it's really not enough to simply close any evidence gap in one geography, as cultural context varies within and also between geographies. And so there's really a need to gather similar evidence from multiple places in order to build an evidence base and to understand as well the context-specific gender differential impacts and approaches to improve the effectiveness of CDRFI. So the evidence gaps that we found exist cross-cut policy areas and evidence themes, and that's by the very nature, cross-cutting nature of gender, but also in terms of the process of gathering evidence itself, so the methodology of how it is collected. And that's whether considerations of social norms and power dynamics between women and men have been factored into that methodological process of gathering evidence. And underpinning sort of the collection of it and the assessment of impact. So these methodologies, cross-cutting themes, really must consider who is collecting, who data is being collected from, when evidence is collected. So for instance, the time of day when women and men are relatively more or less available due to their household caring responsibilities or employment responsibilities. And who's also responsible for collecting that evidence. It's well established that the validity of responses can be influenced whether an enumerator is the same gender as the respondent, for instance. So this sort of all cross-cuts the different evidence priorities. So in terms of the actual evidence gap, so I won't go into all the details, but just to highlight at a high level some of what we've identified. So one being sex disaggregated data within CDRFI related data sets. And there are many data sets that contribute to CDRFI, but some of the sex disaggregated data that's missing is around the Sendai targets, mortality data, insurance access, and also demand as well. There's also evidence gaps in terms of which countries and how specific gender considerations are even just simply mentioned and integrated at a country level with regards to national policies that incorporate CDRFI instruments. And that's before we even get to the action as well. There are also gaps in terms of practical examples detailing what's worked in concrete terms to increase access and usage of CDRFI by different groups of women and men, and to address very specific gender-specific needs for protection. There are also gaps in terms of evidence of successful and effective approaches to overcome gender-specific barriers and increase very specifically women's access and use and control of emergency payouts, given household dynamics there from CDRFI schemes, and that might be at the macro or micro level. And finally, there are also gaps in terms of how different types of gender-smart CDRFI solutions have really positively improved women's adaptive capacities and resilience. Have they actually contributed to improved levels of gender equality and women's empowerment? And there are other areas as well, such as lack of research that exists around payment priorities related to macro solutions. Have they been addressing issues such as violence against women, which we know is an issue post a disaster, reproductive health issues that are specific to women or men? And also just to flag that, you know, is gender and how is gender related vulnerability data actually integrated into catastrophe risk models and analytics in determining risk? So finally, sort of why do we need to invest in gender related evidence creation? We need to invest because actually what we have at the moment is mainly anecdotal. It's mainly collected at the output level, and it's largely absent at this outcome and impact level of CDRFI. Data collection very specifically requires investment in systems. For instance, to collect sex disaggregated data, we need to invest in that collection process. We also need evidence to really further strengthen the business case for incorporating and integrating these gender considerations into different models of CDRFI. And last but not least, we really need to invest in this area because CDRFI related impacts, including gender impacts, cannot be generalized, and any individual's gender identity intersects with other factors as well and characteristics, and that might be their ethnicity, geographical location, life cycle stage, whether they're sort of if they're a woman, if they're childbearing age, and their livelihood strategy as well. And so we really need to invest in evidence creation to move beyond a generalized focus and solutions in order to ensure both the equitable benefits from CDRFI solutions for all genders and all social groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it. Now we're going to pass over to Florian Waldschmidt, who's a project associate with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, to talk about risk information and analysis. Florian, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. Also, thanks for having me today. It was a great pleasure to work in the team on the evidence roadmap. And yeah, I'm talking about risk information and analysis, by its nature, a very cross-cutting issue, as Jen also mentioned earlier. And by that, of course, yeah, the CDRFI actors and stakeholders have to rely on the information and analysis provided to produce and improve financial products, investments, transfer solutions, and so on. But on the other hand, also maybe on the demand side, if you will, decision makers, policymakers have to rely on the results of those analysis and models to make informed decisions, for example, on their investment or adaptation portfolios. And before I go into the gaps or some examples of gaps that I have identified, the good news first, models and data are, of course, constantly improving with new technologies to collect data, with new and more complex models being developed all the time. But this also comes at a cost, of course. Access and ownership of models and data is still an issue, and that would be maybe, or that is one of the issues or one of the gaps identified in the quick impact section. That data sharing, for example, I've heard that several times during my interviews, but also just recently during the Africa Climate Week. One of my panelists mentioned it again to me that even within the same government or between ministries or governmental organizations, data are not necessarily shared, and thus, of course, leaving yeah, different organizations, different institutions with a data gap, even though data would technically be available, but it's just not shared. This also applies to ownership and especially knowledge about models and modeling tools that lie typically in the global north, while communities and the decision makers of those communities most affected by climate change or climate impacts are in the global south and do not have the knowledge to implement models and modeling tools and assessment tools, risk assessment tools, and have to depend on partners for project implementation, and are left with the challenge of replicating or repeating such analysis in the same or different contexts sometime later to build on the previous results. And this, of course, increases costs, and also, is a challenge for them to interpret the results adequately for their decision and policy making. And then another issue or gap that I have come across is interoperability, and this speaks especially on modeling and modeling communities. Think, for example, about communities focusing on vulnerabilities of livelihoods of people, but also social services or social security in terms of access to health, access to education, and this also plays a bit into Catherine's field of gender, right? But also communities focusing on loss and damage or infrastructure, but also environmental assets and ecosystem services that are still a little bit of a side topic, I feel. But then we also have climate modeling, exposure modeling, and all those communities, of course, are experts or have experts focusing on those issues, but this also leaves us with a lot of silos and different standards, different outputs that cannot be necessarily or easily linked with each other. And actually the true benefit of having all those different perspectives would be a further integration and a collaboration between them, creating shared standards, creating shared types of data, using to create more comprehensive approaches covering more complex interrelated cascading and compounding effects. And I see Jen is letting me know I have only a few seconds left, so to the key message, why is this important, or why is this relevant for CDRFI? As I mentioned in the beginning, everybody in the community has to rely on the results of these analyses, and of course more comprehensive analysis would be of huge benefit to all actors in CDRFI, but also decision makers who have to make investment decisions for example, adaptation measures to take advantage of the synergies instead of investing into a bunch of independent measures, but rather focus on a effective portfolio of measures. This also relates, of course, if we talk about modeling, how can this be integrated into quick post-disaster impact assessments or enabling standard frameworks for data scarce environments, right? This is an issue I haven't touched today, but is also part of the section where local and ground data are not available for validation or calibration of models. And yes, with that and the time running out, I'd like to hand back to you, Jen, for the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, Florian. I appreciate it. So now I will transition to the last theme, which is resilience outcomes. I'm happy to be able to talk about this work that was done, co-authored by Archie, Panda, and Zunke Kraft at MCII. I think people probably know that that resilience has been a bit of a buzzword over the last several years, and some people view it as just a buzzword. Other people view it as really a paradigm shift in the way that we think about risk and kind of the humanitarian to development process, humanitarian response to development process. At the same time, you know, regardless of how you view it, I think that we can all agree that it's been one of the dominant framings used for policies and programs aimed at reducing vulnerability to climate change and natural hazards and strengthening ability to manage risk. And while there's kind of a lack of consensus about the best ways to measure resilience, both within the CDRFI community and more broadly, I think it's pretty clear that there is a role for CDRFI to play in helping to strengthen resilience to extreme weather events, climate change, and other natural hazards. So And not only that, I think there's also an expectation within this community that CDRFI will make tangible impacts on resilience in particularly low income and climate vulnerable countries. So if resilience is the logical and appropriate framework for thinking about and understanding the impacts of CDRFI solutions on people, communities, and countries' ability to manage climate and disaster risk, then I think it also provides an opportunity for us to use resilience framing to demonstrate the value of CDRFI approaches and legitimize these approaches. So what's in this section of the evidence roadmap? I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the cost-effective and transformational approaches when it comes to strengthening resilience. And so this section outlines 9 evidence priorities to facilitate a better understanding of the resilience impacts of these different interventions and to promote the resilience strengthening potential of CDRFI solutions. And as mentioned by the others, they're categorized as quick impact, persistent issues, and transformational evidence. So I think to realize the potential and demonstrate the value of CDRFI approaches for strengthening resilience to climate change, natural hazards, and extreme weather events, we really need more investment specifically in the measurement and understanding of resilience impacts, while also trying to avoid potential maladaptive outcomes of various solutions. So I wanted to kind of quickly go through that resilience section before handing over to our next 2 speakers, who will talk about some other sections of the evidence roadmap. So now I'm going to pass over to Zonka Kreft and Vasita Wajanaika, who are the executive directors, respectively, of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative and SLACAN Trust, who are going to talk about joint actions, the evidence framework, and also the way forward. Vasita, hoping you're able to turn your camera on.
Yeah, probably it's me starting, right? Okay. Yeah, we are now going into the next session with a section of the document, which really is about thinking on how to move forward collectively and strategically the topic of evidence within the CDRFI community. I'm co-leading the Impact Working Group together with Vasita and also Dan Birnbaum from Global Parametrics. And we really developed this part of the document together. We had a breakout session at the workshop last year, and we had like several Impact Working Group meetings, I think, over the course of this year to come up with a framework that we collectively can advocate for and that also individual organizations can implement. And me and Vasita, we are going through the framework one by one. I start, and first we basically categorized 3 different types of evidence actions that need to happen. One is evidence norms, and these should appeal to all CDRFI actors, and I will go into the details in a second. We're talking about specific evidence actions, and we also talk about strategic investments that the community should advocate for. So going into evidence norms, we identified 4 areas. One is a general strive towards open data and open access, especially when it comes to the success criteria, success indicators, and also failure indicators. I think as a community, we need to start a paradigm shift towards an honest learning and upscaling activities, and also allowing for this kind of collaborations between implementers and academic actors. And for that, the norm on open access, I think, is important, but of course also protecting, for example, individual user data and things like that. The second one is that collectively the group is calling for meaningful resource sharing towards monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. So we see that as a rough measure, for example, 5% of program funding definitely should be invested into this topic moving forward. The third is that participation and diversity of views in collecting evidence-relevant data is important. And that, for example, speaks to the M&E teams that individual programs set up to make sure that different academic backgrounds, different methodological backgrounds are present, but also when it comes to the ethnicities and voices from the ground in the kind of evidence collection. And then the last norm, which the group encourages to implement, is also to implement general evidence ethics, that general research ethics, for example, to make sure that no harm is done to research subjects, and to make sure that there's full consent on the research subject in engaging in evidence activities as programs are implemented. And I now hand over to you, Rosita, for the next section.
Thank you, Sonke. So now I will discuss the evidence actions, which are focused on 3 elements. One is about language and common technology, enhancing academic outreach. It's the second one, and the third one about triangular evidence cooperation. So if I may start with why language and common technology and terminology as well is important. We work on different complex concepts as well as different aspects that are needing capacity building among different stakeholders. So as part of the Impact Working Group, this has been a big focus as well in the work that we've been doing, so that the stakeholders, the different actors working on CDRFI would be speaking the same language and would be referring to the same elements when decisions are made, and also evidence-based actions are developed. So this is something very important, as well as moving from just being English speaking to going into local language as well, using these terminologies that have been agreed on. The second one on academic outreach is very important, that evidence-based research contribute to the actions that are being developed under this framework. So making sure that the academic research knowledge products are reached, accessible, and also comprehensive in a way that brings together different actors is something that that has been also looked into. So for example, having open source data systems as well as partnerships among different stakeholders that could reach the academic findings and scale up the outreach of these findings as well. Then looking at triangular evidence cooperation, it's important to note that local level, national level actions are important. Again, the partnerships, the cooperation that relates to the capacity building, especially of developing countries, being a focus of the evidence actions. So this is not in isolation, they work together, and how we do this will be something we'll discuss after Sonke speaks next. So Sonke, over to you.
Yeah, now coming to the section on evidence investment, it's quite clear that strategic investment will need to be done to make the evidence roadmap a reality. And again, as part of the Impact Working Group, we came together and we identified 3 strategic topics or 3 strategic investments that would need to happen. One is clearly there need to be specific funding calls, especially to also engage academic stakeholders. But these funding calls on CDRFI evidence generation are relevant to that, or to the knowledge frontiers that we heard in the section before. They also need to set the right incentives, for example, for collaboration between implementers and academic actors. So, for example, these kind of funding calls could encourage hybrid research implementation setups specifically. The second item we identified is that there needs to be a strategic investment into capacity building for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. I mean, if we are really truly saying that this is a paradigm shift, then also there needs to be the capacities, for example, within the implementing agencies to make this a reality. And in the joint discussions, we identified that capacity can be scarce, and also understanding can be scarce. So like a specific capacity strengthening initiative would make sense as a specific investment to move forward the evidence framework. And then lastly, we also discussed that strategically convening the different actors that are relevant to evidence in CDRFI is also an investment that needs to happen. And this might also be something that the impact working group of the IGP takes forward as a role in implementing the evidence framework. Again, over to you, Rosita.
Yes, now we look at the way forward, I think, which is one of the very important aspects of it. So one thing we need to understand is that this is something that needs to be conducted and implemented collectively. All stakeholders need to be involved in the process. And also we need to move from publications and knowledge product numbers to impact assessments where we know the numbers of impact made on the ground. So working with all actors is very important. We'll break down as to how these actors that have been listed could work together through inclusive and participatory processes. So Sonke, you want to start, and then I will take over.
Okay, then I start with governments. It's quite clear that there needs to be a general commitment to evidence-based policy making. It's also quite clear that, especially in the public sector approaches, for example, we ask to determine objectively public value of different solutions and compare them. And this could be like a specific way on how governments can implement the evidence roadmap.
Right. So implementers, I'll take implementers. So how can they play a role? So it's important that they're part of the process, that they work with every other actor so that the actions could be scaled up. It's also important that the common words, the terminology, the technology is communicated and integrated into the systems. And capacity building is also important on how implementers could work with the other actors. And looking at civil society organizations could play a role in engaging with other actors, being a bridge to work with everyone together, working with a civil society organization that has multiple aspects, working on the ground as well as academic focus as a think tank. We see how all these actors could work together, and initiatives that have all parties involved, governments, private sector, civil society, and bringing these evidences to holistic actions is very important. Sonke?
Yeah. I mean, coming also to private sector engagement in terms of evidence, it's quite clear that the private sector needs to embrace the evidence theme as a strategic priority. And also in the joint discussions, we learned that, for example, this can be a way to improve long-term or benchmark product parameters, and with that also improve the long-term financial success of these products. And we ask private sector actors to generally embrace and implement the evidence norms, actions, and investments. And then maybe lastly, coming to the important actor of academia, it's quite clear that research institutions, research actors are the ones responsible to innovate scientific methods and rigor. So in implementing or in responding to some of the research frontiers we heard in the section before, we definitely need to call out academic actors, but it's also important to not stay within disciplinary silos. We discussed collectively that we actually need interdisciplinary setups to, for example, really come down to what we discussed under transformational evidence. And it's also very important that the research funders, which we also put under academia, that they are also moving, and that they're actually actively encouraging academics to go beyond on what is probably usually the usual way of publishing in scientific journals, but not necessarily bringing insights back to frontline communities or implementers themselves. And Rosita?
I think we've covered all of them, but I feel like we could add somewhere the youth and the community also in this, how all of these people could come together because they're at the forefront as well. So thank you, everyone. I think Yannick is supposed to take over from us.
Actually, I'm coming back. You can't get rid of me that quickly. Thank you both, Sönke and Rosita, for those interventions. And I'm going to wrap up just very quickly to make sure that we have 10 minutes for discussion. So just as a reminder, what is the CDRFI Evidence Roadmap? It's a shift from innovation to learning, from one of designing constantly new solutions to trying to understand what is being impactful and share evidence and learning about successes and failures. We hope that there will be amplification of both the need for actions as well as support to the evidence framework through the impact working group of the InsuResilience Global Partnership. And we see the vision behind the roadmap is an evidence-based future where effective CDRFI solutions accelerate climate adaptation and strengthen the resilience of countries, communities, and people to climate change and natural hazards. So at this time, I'd invite all of the speakers to come back and we will open up for a few minutes. We have a very small group, so we definitely will have an opportunity for everybody to ask a question. I see there's already one in the chat, but if folks want to turn their cameras back on, that would be great. Thanks, everyone. So as a reminder, please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. I see Ines has already put one in the chat. I don't know if you want to turn on your camera and ask that live. All right, I'll read it out. I think that it was.
Sorry about that.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
There's a bit of noise over here. Just a second. I turn on the camera. Hi, can you? Okay. Yes, I think I'm live now. Yeah. So this is mainly for Rosita. I was wondering what roles do the different partners play in answering the evidence questions to the roadmap that the roadmap contains? Mainly, how can they contribute to the roadmap and keep building on top of what is already laid for them?
Yeah, I will start, and then I think Sönke could contribute as well. So as part of the Impacts Working Group, we have different actors in the group who have been contributing to the evidence roadmap as well. And there would be a reaching out session where different actors would be engaging in the going forward process. But at the moment, I would think the expert on this to answer this question would be Sönke, because he's the mastermind behind this. Sönke, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I mean, we were a bit rushed to go through all the different evidence actions and also what the individual actors can do and should do. So if you look at the document, of course, it's part of the executive summary, but it's also the detailed section. I think it's page 56, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so that is like maybe general reference to where to find it. When it comes to now the different actors, academia and civil society, I think it is important to recognize that these have, thank you, these they have to play an individual role in moving forward evidence roadmap. As I said, academic actors are the one that actually innovate, for example, methodological setup, whereas civil society, they're very important, for example, in ground truthing activities that are happening, also in a way mirroring evidence-based policy making by governments, also themselves doing advocacy, and we are also calling for evidence-based advocacy in this space, which I think is also important. And lastly, often many civil society organizations are doing implementation at the same time as they're working with frontline communities. And so they are implementers. And again, this means that they should implement evidence norms, including access to success indicators, failure indicators, and things like that. So just to be a bit more specific, and then maybe the last one is also, what does it mean concretely, also for the work of the Impact Working Group? And this is very much in discussion, but also in the document we already outlined a role for the Impact Working Group, which is that of a pacemaker on the topic of evidence and impact in general. So we are expecting also for different evidence commitments to be made, and we definitely will encourage a dialogue on this. We'll also make this open and public, and also, I mean, kind of gathering different evidence actors together, I think could be a role of the Impact Working Group moving forward. And then it's also quite clear that InsuResilience in itself has a governance, and we need to make sure that evidence gets its right place in this governance. So acknowledging, for example, the evidence roadmap as part of the high-level consultative group, which I think took place 3 days ago, is an important part of that, but also bringing it to the program alliance and having program alliance actors reflect for themselves on what evidence means will be one of the follow-up actions.
Thanks, Zunka, and thanks also to Vosita, who's making some great points in the chat, specifically related to the role of CSOs in academia, not just in generating knowledge, but also in knowledge management and communication. So thanks to both of those points. I think Kai had a hand raised. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
Thanks, Jen, and I'll also quickly put on my camera. I'd like to come back to the gender topic, and Catherine, I really liked that you went into the details of data collection, which are so important and so crucial for successful data collection in terms of gender. And I know that there's this gender M&E guidance note out there. Maybe you want to take the chance to advertise that as well. And maybe in your response also highlighting what are the challenges coming from this guidance note also for the other evidence themes in the evidence roadmap, because gender is so cross-cutting the other topics.
So thank you, Kay. So for those of you who are not aware, there's recently been an InsuResilience Gender Working Group guidance note that has been published, which is a how-to guide on looking at the gender dimensions of M&E for CDRFI. So do take a look at that. It's on online on the InsuResilience website and on the Gender Centre of Excellence as well. So do take a look at that too. In terms of the challenges, I think I raised in my point the issue that actually at the moment a lot of the measurement, because what we're doing it's new and it's very output orientated. What we really need to be moving towards, and this cross-cuts all of the different models of CDRFI, is look at the longer term impacts, both intended and unintended consequences, as well of some of the innovation that we're doing in this area, and also, you know, in terms at a policy level as well, whether, you know, integrating some of these gender considerations actually into policies are actually resulting in action in the on the ground. And so indicators that need to be developed that look at this, and this is what we found through the how-to guide as well, need to move beyond just simply sex disaggregating data that is output orientated to look at more impact orientated results, and so that will require qualitative methodologies as well as quantitative, and ensuring that we're consulting with different groups of women and men, and both direct and indirect beneficiaries. And as part of that, recognizing this intersectionality, that a response from one woman with certain characteristics, in a particular life cycle stage, say without children, is not going to be the same necessarily as those who have small children that they're caring for after a disaster, for instance, and have payout priorities that address their needs as well as the needs of other groups of people. So hopefully that sort of touches on some of the challenges a little bit, because it is difficult to do that, but we do need to be moving towards getting those insights at that impact level, outcome level as well.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks, Kai, for the question. I'd like to open it up to Edmund now to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I have a simple question. From the discussion, we've come to understand that we need collaborative effort if we can produce evidence. And my question is to the IGP fund calls. I mean, I want to know if it's part of the criteria that the innovations that get funded also has a component that looks at impact. Because I mean, I'm a researcher and I look into index-based weather insurance, and it's quite challenging to get on board to have this multi-sectorial. I mean, how we slot research into private sector to make sure we are getting the necessary data to do impact studies. It's a bit lacking. So what happens is you want to embark on your own project which looks at impact, but you don't find the right partner or the right product on which to do this impact on. So I'm just asking if it's part of your criteria, and moving forward, how do we make sure that the innovation that we are churning out also has this impact component that forces private and implementers to also reach out to researchers to bring them on board? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Edmund, for the question. It's a great one. And actually, there's quite a bit in there. I'd just start quickly by saying that I think that one of the things we're hoping the roadmap will do will really put some pressure on donors to address these issues more concretely. And there's a lot donors can do if there are either funding solutions or funding research to make sure that these different components are brought in. I'd like to specifically ask Tara to maybe comment on some of her experience kind of from the funder perspective about, what can be done, and also in terms of bringing different partners together, because I think that's also a component that you're touching on, is making sure that there's a space where we can connect the researchers with the private sector actors with the implementers. So Tara?
There are so many questions in there. No, this is a really good question. We do a lot of research around index-based insurance as well. And when we give awards to researchers, one of the requirements we have is actually similar. We have a habit of funding a lot of research that then doesn't necessarily go anywhere either, because it's specifically in the research sphere rather than in the private sector sphere or things like that. So one of the things we require from all of our researchers is that when they come to us, they have a meaningful relationship with the implementers, whether it's public or private sector, such that if the results are positive and the impacts are positive, that the work can continue long after the research has ended. We've observed a lot of times where the research is actually propping up the intervention, because the researchers want to test something and they bring somebody on board to test the neat idea they have, without necessarily having the full commitment of partners. So that's one of the ways in which we're trying to really overcome that. Another thing we're doing is we're trying to do better engagement of researchers on the ground and in the countries of research who might have better relationships. So for example, if I'm interested in doing an impact evaluation of an index-based product in Tanzania, I might not be in the best position to develop those relationships and identify the most willing and able partners. It's the Tanzanian researchers on the ground and engaging and building our networks more broadly that we're hoping will also help us identify those institutions and those partners who are actually willing to engage in research and meaningful, rigorous research to understand the impacts.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you, Vosita, for coming in. Really appreciate it. And I think that's a great last question to end on. We are out of time anyway, but I did want to give the others, I saw a lot of nodding in agreement with the question, Edmund. So I wanted to give the others a chance to come in with additional points before we close, if there are any. All right, great. Well, then thank you all for joining. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for your participation. And a huge thanks to all of the speakers who not only took the time to speak today, but also spent a lot of time working on the document. We're thrilled to have it out and really appreciate your contributions. And we hope that we will see you all soon at COP as well. So have a great rest of your day and a great end to the annual forum.